Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group, which, as of this recording, has 352,000 members worldwide. And because I have the privilege of leading the group, I've met a lot of you, including Beth Brooks today. She is our speaker. She is the founder of Decision Driver Analytics, a firm that she started 11 years ago. And she is my go-to resource for matters of reimbursement and value analysis committees. And candidly, I've been waiting for this day for a couple of years now. She's a very busy woman. I'm very grateful for her time. Let's give a warm medical device group welcome to Dr. Beth Brooks. Everyone's applauding now. And I'm going to put myself on mute. Have a good show.
Okay, thanks so much, Joe, and thanks to everyone for joining in this morning. And I've got a quote up there that I'm certainly hoping everybody can see to kind of set the stage. I'm not scared of the FDA, but I'm scared to death of value analysis committees. And that was from a CEO of one of our startup medical device firm clients. And while I don't hear that precise quote every single day, I can tell you I hear something very, very similar to that at least a couple of times a week. And I hear it both from startup medical device firms, but also from very large, well-established medical device companies who are really in the process still of learning how to respond to the changing hospital sales environment. So I am going to switch here to the next slide. The title, How to Get Past the Value Analysis Committee, really came about when I was talking to Joe one day, and I'm really appreciative, Joe, of this opportunity to present to the group. We were talking about our clients and what a difficult time some of them are having with the Value Analysis Committee process, and Joe really encouraged me to develop this webinar. And he said, How to Get Past the Value Analysis Committee would be a great title, really, to get people interested, to know what you're going to talk about. And so again, I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you today and for all of you dropping in. So to get us started, I really want to set the stage, and I want to set the stage using a slide from a lecture I give every fall at the University of Minnesota's Technology Leadership Institute. And it really is going to help to explain why value analysis committees exist. So if we take a look at this slide, this is a depiction of the US healthcare value chain. And what you see is groups paying for healthcare are starting on the left-hand side. You see the financiers, government employers, individual insurers or payers on the left-hand side. And then you see the providers of technology, the groups providing the innovation coming in from the right-hand side, the suppliers, the medical device companies, the distributors. And what you see happening that's depicted there at the top is really you see where does that collision process happen? You have money flowing in from the left, you have innovation flowing in from the right, and it's colliding right in the middle at the provider level. So that's exactly why value analysis committees exist. Facilities want to adopt new technologies, but they're constrained by resources. They want to bring in your innovations, but they're dealing with a changing reimbursement environment. They're dealing with financial restraint coming from the left-hand side. So they have to evaluate what products provide the best overall value for their facilities. And it's really not an easy thing for them to do. So that's why we're talking today. How do we help them to do that? So demonstration of value from that depiction, I think it's easy to see why that's critical to the success of your innovative technologies. You demonstrate safety and efficacy to get regulatory approval, but that only gets you so far. A number of years ago, I was at a conference and there was a speaker there from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And that speaker said, the FDA gives you permission to sell your technology, but it honestly doesn't give me a single reason why I should buy it. And that's the same message that's coming out of our hospitals now. they really don't have a reason to buy your technology unless you can demonstrate the combined clinical and economic value to the facilities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you do that? So value analysis committees, let's just define, we'll call them VACs. I'll use that shorthand quite frequently. What are they? What are they all about? Moving from the fear to understanding. So we're not afraid of what we understand. And so what we want to do today in this presentation is really help you to understand what value analysis committees are. Who are they? Why were they formed? What do they do? And in gaining that understanding, help you to understand how to get past them, how to get through them, how to have them make a favorable decision about your technology. So to set this up, let's present, first of all, a few myths about the hospital sales process. So a number of years ago, the first myth that's listed there was true. Clinician preference rules. If you had a surgical supply, you just needed to go into the hospital and talk to the surgeons and get the surgeons to really believe in your technology, to really want your technology. They would take it to the hospital and the hospital would get them what they wanted. That doesn't work anymore. Then things shifted completely the other direction. Low cost rules. So as hospitals began to try and control their escalating healthcare costs, they said, okay, well, if there's two supplies that do the same thing, we're going to go with the one that costs the less. And so that shift happened, but that also didn't work for them in containing their costs. So there was a, again, kind of a resetting of expectations. Another myth, VACs are all the same. Every single VAC that you go to at every single hospital is the same. And that's not true, unfortunately. It would be easier if they were all the same. They're bad for innovation. Again, not true. You just have to understand what they're looking for. And then finally, the last myth, certainly not the last myth that exists, but the last myth that we'll talk about today is that really it's easier to sell to hospitals than it is to get payer coverage. And that used to be true, again, but not so much anymore. And so I've talked about some of this already, but we'll expand on a few points. The reality is that these days, it's neither clinician preference nor cost that rules the decision-making process. We've tried to equalize. We dialed it from purely physician preference to purely a cost decision-making process, and now we've kind of dialed it back to try and look at all facets of the decision. That's what VACs do. They have a multifaceted evaluation process. I don't believe that's going to change because that's what is working better for them to balance, short-term costs, short-term preferences versus longer-term outcomes, longer-term cost implications. It is true that VACs are getting tougher to influence. I don't think they're quite as hard as the third-party payers, the Blue Cross Blue Shields, the United Healthcares, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services just yet, but they're definitely getting tougher. But having said all of that, this is one thing that I tell my clients all the time, whether we're talking about trying to establish coverage with payers or whether we're talking about influencing value analysis committees. Don't say that you hate them. Don't say, oh, I hate the VACs. I wish they didn't exist. Why do we have to do this? And, just establishing all this negativity. They're your customers. And that's really how you have to think about them. Just like you think about any other customer group. You think about the surgeon as your customer. You think about other nurses or physicians as your customer. Well, the VACs are your customers. And so you have to respond to them in that way and give them what they want. And really just changing your mindset about it is really, really important and is very helpful in helping you get through that process. So what is it? What is a value analysis committee? And, again, I'm not going to read the slide, but it's really just a formal committee or a team that's been developed within hospitals to evaluate new technology acquisitions primarily, although they do other things as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. And they also have different, different names. So most commonly they're called value analysis committees. So you'll hear the back term most commonly. They can also be called tech assessment committees. They can be called executive medical device and product committees. They can be called commodity committees. There's lots of different names. So I've had clients come to us in the past who say, well, we have to get past the tech assessment committee and you're telling us about value analysis committees. And it's like, oh, it's the same thing. Any committee within the hospital that's really evaluating these technologies, that's really what we're talking about today. And again, typically, although they can vary, what is common with the VACs is that there's different stakeholder groups within the hospital who make up those committees. There are always physicians, there are always nurses, there's always purchasing agents. There are typically liability specialists within the hospitals. There's, again, typically supply chain management, but there can be other members of the group. I mean, we've heard of cases where there's the janitorial team administration on the value analysis committee, and they really have a voice. If they're speaking up about a certain technology being more burdensome from their perspective, that's listened to by the committee. So it's really important to understand at individual hospitals who's on those teams and understand what their voices might contribute to the story. So what do they do? And again, mostly what we're going to be talking about today is their selection of new technologies, their process for adopting new technologies within the hospital. That's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. But they do other things. So they establish and monitor product trials. So a lot of times the value analysis committees, a favorable decision by the value analysis committee will be that they'll trial your product. They'll say, okay, we believe your evidence that you're showing to us, but we still want to see how it works in our hospital. So let's try it for a year, and we're going to track, these patient outcomes metrics, and we're going to track these financial metrics, and we're going to see at the end of that year how your product is performing, and then we'll make a final decision about adopting it moving forward and take it off of the trial period. But they also will do things like look at high volume or high cost products that they already are using in their facility. So if there's a certain technology that is being used a lot in a lot of different cases, and those cases are really costly to the hospital, they might go back and say, okay, how are we really using that technology? Is that something that we need to use in all of these cases? Or is this a high cost technology that maybe is better served in a very specific patient population? And so they'll go back and examine that and figure out, what are their patterns of use within the hospital? And again, for a new technology coming in, that can be an opportunity. If you have a technology coming in that perhaps is a lower cost than something that's currently used, these kinds of evaluations can be opportunities for you to demonstrate your value to the hospital. So how can you influence them? And in a few minutes, we're really going to spend most of our time today talking through some case studies and then answering your questions. But how can you influence them? And this goes back again to, thinking of them as your customers. How do you influence your customers? Well, you give them what they want. You give them what they need to make their evaluation. So what do they want? They want information on safety of your technology compared to what they're currently using or other alternatives. They want to know, does it work? Is it effective in their patient populations? And again, how does that compare to what they're currently doing? Does it offer process improvement within the hospital? Does it let them get patients through their operating rooms more quickly? Does it allow a facility to turn over that operating room more quickly because perhaps the cleanup process is less time intensive than with previous technologies? Does it let them improve their quality? Can your technology help them reduce hospital-acquired infection rates, for example, things that they're tracked on that are important to them? And can it impact both their costs, which we've talked about already, can it help them reduce overall costs long term, or can it help them increase revenue? And we have a case study where we'll talk about that particular scenario where perhaps we weren't reducing costs, but we were increasing the opportunity for revenue in other areas of the hospital. So those are all ways that you can influence them. So how do you go about getting that information to them? Giving them what they need. And I want to start here with a quote that I think is really, really important. What are the biggest mistakes device companies make in presenting their products to hospital value analysis committees? And this was a question that was asked of a vice president at ECRI Institute, which is an independent institute that really evaluates product performance and provides recommendations on that to hospital members of the institute. And I thought these 4 bullet points from his response were really important to understand. Number 1, they don't examine the environment they're selling into. They don't understand, for example, that a small community hospital may have very different pain points and a different evaluation process from a large academic research institution. They don't understand the environment they're selling into, and so they really aren't presenting the right information. They focus on features and benefits. And again, this goes back more to the old, sell to clinicians and only to clinicians. Get the surgeon to want the way that that new technology feels in his or her hand. Get them to really want to use that product and focus on features and benefits for the surgeon. That's not going to make it past the value analysis committees anymore. You have to focus on the evidence, the comparative effectiveness, the value. Again, related to the next quote, there has to be a compelling clinical or economic reason for the change, not just a user preference. And they don't engage everyone in the process. Again, just focusing on the clinicians and on reported benefits, or even though it's not featured here, just focusing on costs of the supply and not looking at a longer term, more holistic picture. All of those things are things that are not giving value analysis committees what they need to make good decisions. So what is it that they do want? So they want that evidence, and they want it in a very specific way on one hand, but we're going to talk in just a minute through the case studies about how there's a whole bunch of different ways that can look. So they want this combined clinical and economic evidence, but they really want to understand what it looks like in their own patient populations, which, again, depending on where the facility is and the type of facility it is, a small rural hospital in the mountains of Western North Carolina, where I am, is very different from a large academic research institution in the Northeast. Can look very, very different. Their own facility type, their own data. If there's a way to incorporate their own data, their own information into the information you're presenting back to them, they like that. Their own situation. So as much as you can make it applicable to them, and that's where understanding the environment that you're selling into is really important. The more you can make it applicable to them, the more compelling your evidence is to them, and the more likely that you'll be able to persuade them to adopt your technology. Okay. So let's talk through these case studies. And again, I'm going to spend the most time here. The case studies are each presented over a couple of pages, but I'm going to kind of talk a lot through them and give you a few more details than what you'll see on the slides. And the primary message that I want to convey before we get started with that is, kind of wrapped up in this quote, there aren't any secrets to this, or there's not a single secret to this. It's really the result of preparation. So analyzing the situation, working hard and learning from what doesn't work. And that's really a key element, learning from what doesn't work. Most of our clients come to us after what they've been doing hasn't worked. Some of them come to us, just from the get-go saying, we know we need help with this, but most of them come to us after they went out and tried something and it didn't work. So we take that as a great opportunity to say, okay, that didn't work. So what did you do? And what about it didn't work? And then that can help to inform, what we help them to do moving forward. So having said all of that, each of these case studies has been set out to present, different examples where we did something very different in each case to help each of these clients achieve success with a value analysis committee. And I'm going to kind of start with the simplest solutions and progress through, more complex things that needed to be done to be convincing to the value analysis committees. But one of the, again, one of the strongest messages that I want to get across is that it doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't have to look just the same for every single client and every single product. So in this case that we're going to talk through, it was really just a qualitative research effort that allowed us to help this client. So we had a situation where there was a client who had a disposable single-use surgical supply that was replacing a reusable surgical supply, and they were actually cannibalizing their own product. So it was their own reusable surgical supply that was mostly being used, but now they realized that due to forces in the marketplace, they really needed to move into the single-use supplies. And so that's what they were doing. But they were getting a lot of pushback from the facilities. And, this was a high volume supply. It was used in any kind of a general surgery. And what they had done something that really seemed like it should have worked, because they knew they needed an economic argument. They knew it wasn't just about clinical features and benefits. They weren't just trying to sell to the surgeons. They had actually developed a really nice, really detailed interactive budgetary impact model for use by the facilities to evaluate the impact of that disposable versus reusable supply. And so they had incorporated all the things that, we typically would have told them to incorporate. You have to think about with the reusable, there are a lot of hidden costs in terms of sanitation, chain of custody, where does that product go? How does it move within the hospital? Restocking it, what are the costs of, if some of the supplies accidentally are thrown away, so on and so forth. They had done all of that, but what was happening is the facilities were saying, whoa, 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 way too much. We don't have time to go and do all of this research, because there were a lot of data points that the facility had to enter. They needed to put in their own information on a lot of different variables in order to make this model work. And they just weren't willing to invest the time into the tool. And so they were really pushing back on the amount of time and effort in that. And so what we did is we really, in looking at the tool, we said, you know what, it does seem to us to be just too complicated. Maybe you're trying to, put dollars and cents to every single potential value proposition in a way that's, first of all, making it too burdensome, and second, making them feel like if you dropped any of those parameters, you didn't have a story, like you were trying too hard, throwing in the kitchen sink. And so we said, why don't we just talk to some of these facilities and talk to some of the staff who would make up value analysis committees and just hear from them, what is most important to them in evaluating this decision to switch from a reusable to a disposable. And so in doing that, we talked to clinical practitioners, we talked to supply chain management, we talked to nursing staff, and what we really learned is it really wasn't, the finances that were the primary concern at facilities who had already made that switch to a disposable. We were hearing from them that it was a lot about the potential for hospital-acquired infection. That even if the facility hadn't experienced hospital-acquired infections due to these reusable instruments, they were worried about it. And accrediting institutions were worried about it. And so many of them were making the switch just because of that. And that in terms of the finances, they wanted to know what the cost impact would be, but that wasn't the crucial factor in their decision-making process. And so we were able to take that information. We, conducted this analysis at a number of different facility types and really prepared a white paper that described those findings. And we updated their budgetary impact model to say, okay, take out all this detail. Let's focus on two main points, hospital-acquired infection being one of them, and go back out with this information. And so this client is currently using this information, and the feedback that we've gotten is that it's been real successful for them and helping them get through that back approval process. So again, an example of something where less was more. We took something complicated, made it simpler, and we were able to do that by, just doing the research and talking to people in a way to help us understand and to help our client understand what was really important and what was going to be compelling. So to move into, the second case study, this is another very straightforward example of something that was really, really simple and very effective for our client. In this case, we had a client with an innovative small bowel feeding tube that obviously would be used in a critical care setting. And their situation that they came to us with is look, our feeding tube costs about 3 to 4 times as much as the standard feeding tubes that the hospitals are using. And so whenever we go in and talk to the hospitals about that, they're just saying, we just can't justify that. If it was a little bit more, okay, maybe we'd talk to you, but 3 times, 4 times as much as what we're paying, we just can't justify that. And so they just didn't know what to do with that information. And so again, understand the situation, try to understand what the story is. And so in talking with this client and examining the data that they already had, we realized that their own data already showed that there were reductions in other resources that were being used when their feeding tube was used versus the standard. So in this particular case, the standard small bowel feeding tubes had to be placed under fluoroscopic guidance. That wasn't necessary for the innovative tube. We also determined through some additional research that there was already a lot of hospital waste associated with the standard feeding tubes, that actually if it wasn't placed appropriately the first time, well, then that one got thrown out and they had to, bring out another one and put that one in. And what we actually saw through our own research was that they were using typically 3 of the standard feeding tubes to get 1 placement. Well, right there, that's your 3 times cost that's being eaten up. So we were able to put together just a super simple, and I mean super simple, little budgetary impact model that just said, the higher cost of the innovative product is more than offset by the reduction in these other medical resource utilization. There's not as much waste, and there's not as much use of these other resources within the hospital. There's no need for fluoroscopic guidance, there are fewer x-rays, so on and so forth. And so with this simple tool, again, it was just really impactful for this client to be able to take something really simple and say, yeah, we know it costs 3 times as much, but look at this. Look at how things really stack up if you look at the number of patients that you need to use these feeding tubes in and how the resources really lay out. And so that was something they were able to present to the hospital purchasers and then get them as their champions through the VAC process. Okay, so we're moving into some that are a little bit more complicated now in terms of what was necessary to be influential with the value analysis committees. And here we're looking at how we utilize an administrative database analysis to really help our clients. So in this case, this is actually a couple of different clients and a couple of different technologies. So it's very, very generic in this case because I'm trying to encapsulate several. But in both cases, there were surgical supplies that were to be used on a prophylactic basis to prevent specific procedural complications. So they were used in surgeries, several different types of surgeries, a couple very different types of products. But the net result was that they were going to be used to prevent procedural complications. And so again, the client came to us and said, we're really having a hard time convincing facilities that they should pay for this prophylactic technology to prevent what are really pretty rare complications. So, why should, the question from the hospitals was, why should we pay however much more on every single procedure to prevent something that happens, between 2 and 4% of the time, not very commonly. And so what we realized that we needed to do in this case was to really understand, first of all, what's the true rate of those rare complications? Because, what we saw in the literature and what the hospitals were reporting, was kind of all over the board. You would see, it only happens in 1% of cases to, it happens in up to 15% of cases. So we really felt like we needed to understand what's the true rate. And then, regardless of what the true rate is, how expensive is it when this, rare complication happens? And in the cases that I'm kind of throwing in together here, in both cases, they were pretty catastrophic surgical complications. So our assessment, just off the cuff before we did the analysis was, okay, even if they're really very rare, they're really expensive, and hospitals may not understand just how expensive they are. And so in looking at, the cost of preventing it versus, the cost of when they occur, it really may offset one another. And so that's what we did, is we designed and executed an administrative database analysis to, to just look at, these procedures and how frequently these complications occurred and how expensive they were. And in the analysis, sure enough, they were so expensive that it would have been beneficial to prevent them, rather than, just deal with them when they occur. So we prepared some peer-reviewed communications, and our clients, I think, the 2 or 3 that are encapsulated here, in all those cases, they really took that information and developed their own budgetary impact models that utilize those findings, and then use those models to successfully influence the VACs and expand access. So again, it was just kind of a different way of looking at this for them to help them tell that story. And ultimately, and anybody who's worked with me in the past, or any of you who might work with us in the future, it's really about telling that story in a compelling way, telling your value story in a compelling way to the facility. Okay, so again, this is another a case study that's really a couple of different case studies kind of wrapped up into one. They were similar enough that I kind of, put them together here. So in both cases here, they were diagnostic technologies that were entering different, that were in different indications, but in both cases, there were gold standard diagnostics that were really entrenched within the facilities. And so a difficult kind of scenario to break into. And, the challenge that was presented back to us was, the facilities recognize that our diagnostic is pretty doggone cool, and that it works really well. And in fact, it works better. They'll admit that it works better than what they're currently using. But the problem is that these facilities, they have a lot of income coming in, due to the use of their gold standard diagnostic. They have whole diagnostic labs that are built around this. And so, more efficient diagnosis to them is meaning, they're losing revenue compared to what they're currently doing. And so that's a pretty difficult, story to tell. That's a pretty difficult situation to face. And so what we did in this case is we said, okay, well, if you're diagnosing more efficiently, then is there an opportunity to, show the facility that if you diagnose more efficiently, that you're actually not losing revenue, you're just moving it within the hospital. You're moving patients into treatment procedures that can offset that lost diagnostic income and also improve the patient's outcome. So, the question then is, but can we prove that? So that was our idea, that may be happening, but we had to prove it. So in this case, there was an administrative database analysis that had already been performed by the client, but they hadn't really put it to work for them yet. They had a publication, but they really hadn't done anything more than that. So we developed a model to, take the data from that administrative database analysis and also from the peer-reviewed literature to, put that story together. And at the same time, we were developing companion models to support payer coverage, because in this case, there were actually both things happening. The facility had to make a decision to utilize the technology, but in this case, there was payer coverage that was at risk as well. And so we developed companion pieces to support the payer coverage aspect. And so again, the outcome was, the client was able to use those tools successfully with both the VACs, showing them that kind of increasing their revenue model at the same time as improving patient outcomes. And then at the same time, the payer model to show, again, short-term higher cost from a payer perspective, longer term, lower cost and more appropriate treatment for the patients. So those two things worked hand in hand very nicely. Okay, and then the final case study that we have here is one that was, again, fairly complicated. So this one was a surgical supply that was to be used in complex surgical cardiac procedures. And so the situation is one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The supply had a demonstrated ability through their clinical studies to improve patient outcomes and to reduce surgical time. So those are great things. But the problem was that the supply itself cost several $1,000s, and the hospital was not going to get any additional reimbursement outside the standard procedure payment. So because of that, the facilities are really slow to adopt. Why are we going to spend $2,000 more or something like that for your technology if we're not getting paid more? That's just eating into our margin. Why would we do that? What's the value proposition for us? So it's pretty clear why facilities were slow to adopt in that case. So what we were able to do here is to say, okay, so what we need to do is to show these facilities that because the patient outcomes are improved, that the facility's overall cost in managing those patients while they're in the hospital is also reduced. So what we did is we designed a case match study to identify via electronic medical records similar patients who had received standard of care treatment and looked at those outcomes. So we had the data from those facilities from the technology's pre-approval pivotal trial that was collected prospectively. We said, okay, now let's go back and let's pull, case matched patients who received this cardiac procedure without using the technology, and let's look at their outcomes and what their hospital billing data looked like compared to what was collected in the pivotal trial. And in doing that, we were able to determine that even though the innovative supply was obviously an added expense to the hospital, it was associated with lower overall hospital costs and improved outcomes for the patient. So the facility really was recapturing, what they were spending on the technology and then some. And so again, take that information, develop a simple budgetary impact model that the facilities can modify to put their own data into, find a champion in the hospital to take that to the value analysis committee, and there's your story to help impact that decision process. And again, this tool was developed quite a long time ago, and our client continues to use that tool to successfully influence the value analysis committees. So before we hit kind of key takeaways and then open up to questions, I just wanted to share a little bit of feedback that we've gotten, and without reading through these, you've got them in front of you. Just some feedback that we've gotten. First of all, from a large medical device firm. This was a client we had who said, what, we've always been selling just to the surgeons and convincing the surgeons that, they wanted our product. And that's worked for us for a long time, but it's not working for us anymore. And we don't know how to tell the health economic story. We don't know how to tell our value proposition. And so the feedback to us is that, the budgetary impact model we put together was just really helpful to them, and it turned the tide. They had an economic story to tell. So now, they still had their good influence with the surgeons. The surgeons were their champions within the value analysis committees, but now they could arm their surgeons with economic information to take to the rest of the committee. And it was something that was really important for them to see how that worked. And while we just worked with them on one particular product, we know that they are now carrying that forward, themselves. They're incorporating that into their sales process now for other products. A second quote is related to the fact that this doesn't always have to be complicated. And we had, again, the CEO of a startup med device firm who, came to us initially and said, I don't know what to do about the vax because we just don't have that much money. How can we possibly implement a study that's going to persuade the vax when we don't have very much money? We just can't run a big prospective study. And we were able to do something pretty simple for them that was influential. And so the message was, we really didn't realize that we could do this, even on a small budget, a small company. So thanks for showing us that we could, if we were thoughtful about it. And, now we're making progress and we're getting accepted in the marketplace faster than we thought we would. So, two very different companies, two very different places, but, all getting to success, which is what we're trying to help our clients do. Okay. So I'll wrap up with key takeaways here before we open up to questions from you all. So key takeaways, and I've talked about them all, but we'll just kind of hammer them home again. What works for vax these days, is what works for payers and vice versa. They all want evidence of that combined clinical and economic value. It's the perspective that's different. The payers are looking at, long-term cost and outcomes implications from their perspective, what they're paying. Hospitals are looking at it, typically a shorter term perspective, but a little longer term than it used to be, given the bundled payment environments that are erupting around the country. But it's the same concept. So, if you're on the phone, listening to this and you have a technology that's, you're really not selling into hospital vax, but you really need to develop payer coverage, same concepts can apply to you. Second takeaway, and I've talked about this a little bit through the case studies, is, unfortunately, you can't go in and present to the VAC. So you can't, get yourself on their agenda and present to them, but you can arm committee members with what you've developed. You have a good relationship with a clinician, we'll give that clinician the economic information. You have a good relationship with the purchaser, get that information to the purchaser to bring back to the committee. It works the same way. And I've said this ad nauseum already, so I won't spend too much time on it, but every situation is different. And you really have to think about what's going to work in your situation. We have clients that we worked with for a number of years on a number of products, and every single situation, every single solution we've developed for them has been different because it just depends. And then finally, on this slide anyway, don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. Again, this is something that we try to hammer home all the time. If it can be simple, make it simple. If you've got an easy story, tell an easy story. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be because you think it looks more impressive. It actually looks more like you're trying to trick them, is our experience. And then, again, so how do you generate influential evidence? We went through some case studies that, showed, each of these examples, qualitative research, make sure you know what's important before you try to convince them, based on your assumption of what's important to the value analysis committees. On the theme of keeping it simple, and also on the theme of, keeping your own expenses lower, maximize what you have. Maximize the data you already have on your technology. Maximize what's already been published on your technology and on what's out there already. Use what's there. wherever possible so that you don't have to generate new data. But if that's not enough, if that doesn't get you, to tell the story that you need to tell, perform an administrative database analysis where that's possible. So if you can, get information from a claims or a hospital database, or the premier hospital database that has lots and lots of contributing hospitals, or the Truven data sets, do that. Pull information on what actually happens with the competing technologies, and then combine that with the data that you have on your technology, and see what you can make of that. Or utilize small retrospective studies like the last case study that I walked through. So you have an opportunity to go into multiple different facilities to access their electronic medical records for patients, mine a lot of information in that way. It's much less expensive than a prospective data collection effort. Very often you don't need IRB approval. You can get an IRB waiver and move forward relatively quickly with something like that. But then finally, sometimes you need small prospective data collection efforts. If the data from the EMR isn't sufficient, then sometimes you do have to collect data prospectively. But again, it's not always a huge study that needs to be conducted. It can be something relatively small at just a few facilities to generate the kind of data that you need. And then ultimately, what do you do with that data? Well, populate the budgetary impact models with what you've gathered, and leave places where the facility can enter their own data, where it's appropriate and where it's necessary to the conversation. And then finally, remember, above all else, they're your customers. So as you do with all of your customers, don't try to get around them. Don't get aggravated with them. Give them what they want and what they need, and it's doable. You can find a way to do it, regardless of who you are, where you are in your company's history, and where your product is and its history. You can do something to influence them. So having said all of that, I think we can turn it over to, whoops. Oh, I skipped the questions.
No.
So we just got my
I deleted
information.
that page.
Oh, you deleted that page.
I deleted
okay.
that page because, believe me, you have questions. Beth, that was super great. I really enjoyed it myself. And
well, thank you.
I have to say, I just love your presentation style. You just sound so warm and knowledgeable, and you just talk plainly, and everyone can understand what you're saying. I don't imagine you ever lose clients.
Well, bless you. That's a very nice thing to say, Joe. Thank you.
You're welcome. You have so many questions. I hope you can stay longer than the hour.
I can.
And for those of you who are listening, I just shared the slides with a new feature. I didn't know that I could do that before, so you already have the slides. And after this presentation, we will have the video uploaded to YouTube, and I'll make sure that everyone gets that as well. Okay, I'm taking a deep breath. Victoria starts us off with, how would you recommend obtaining granular level population data about the hospital in order to devise case studies?
Granular level hospital information.
Population data about the hospital.
Data about the hospital. I'm going to have to think about that one for a little bit, Victoria, and maybe get back with you. There's several ways that we've done it in the past. There are several databases that we can access to look at, demographics of, certain locations and, specific hospital segments. We also have a database called Definitive Healthcare that we quite frequently mine for information that has data on, those hospitals and the patients that they serve. In terms of patients that have a specific indication within that hospital, I think we'd have to think about that a little bit more, how we could reach out to those hospitals and perhaps get them interested in sharing some information with us, which is actually not as difficult as you think it might be if you show them that you're trying to help them. to evaluate your technology. But let's chat about that offline a little bit more, Victoria, if you don't mind, because I'd like to delve into that a little more deeply with you.
Shashwat asks a really good question. Not that Victoria's wasn't, but this one really intrigues me. If your device reduces post-procedure complications, but the complications are reimbursed separately, how do you present an economic value in that case?
That is a very good question.
I told you.
It is a very good question. So what you're trying to do with the hospital in that case, and again, it's a little bit off the cuff, and we want to explore it in a little more detail, but hospitals are charged in today's environment with meeting the triple aim of healthcare, and they're being evaluated in that way. So they're supposed to do all three of these things simultaneously, which, as I list them, you'll realize is not easy to do. They're supposed to improve population health. They're supposed to reduce overall costs of care, and they're supposed to improve the patient experience of care. So the only thing that's happening in the scenario that you're describing is the hospital's being made whole if the patient suffers from complications. So they suffer from a complication, they get reimbursed separately for it, but the patient still has a complication that is certainly not improving population health, and it's certainly not improving the patient experience of care. And even if they're being reimbursed separately for it, they're also expending resource to manage that. So maybe they're, and quite often with complications, and depending on what the complications are and how they occur, very often they're not getting paid as much as they're actually spending. So they're not losing as much money as they might otherwise, but they may still be losing some. But you can certainly make the case that you're definitely not improving population health. You're definitely not improving the patient experience of care. And your new technology that's reducing those complications is doing both of those things. And it's probably also not hurting their bottom line. And so I would kind of develop that three-pronged package for them.
Fantastic. Jessica asks, is it enough for the total cost savings of the new device to equal the old one? Or does it have to be some percent better than the old one?
No, it's absolutely enough for it to equal the old one.
Let
if
me
you're
follow
not
up
showing.
Then she asks how to address the time cost to the hospital of converting the new device product, training, and the like.
Yeah, it's another great question. And and they really do want to incorporate that. So you're describing a scenario where, once the technology is already firmly in place at the hospital, it's going to be about a wash in terms of costs. But there will be some, ramp up period where they have to get retrained on the supply, they have to get the old stuff off the shelf, the new stuff on the shelf, and there's a cost associated with that. I think the best way to present that, and we've done it in the past, is just be really upfront about it. Okay, guys, this is going to cost you this much more to get this product on your shelf. In the long term, it's going to cost you about the same as what you're currently doing, but there has to be a but. What's it doing that's better? How is it improving patient outcomes? How is it improving that patient experience of care? How is it improving population health? And that initial fee to kind of switch from one supply to another, that's a short-term cost. It's not something that's going to continue moving forward. Quite often there's also another story that you can tell that's related to if your technology is improving outcomes, the more that the payers are reimbursing hospitals in a larger bundle rather than on a procedure specific basis, the better it is for them long term to be improving outcomes. So there's probably a play in that area too, if we could talk a few more details about your technology. So again, be happy to do that offline, but that's kind of the direction I would go in with it.
I fully expect Carlo will be following up with you immediately after this presentation. He has so many questions and they are really sound, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them. I have to ask this first of them, though. He says, if a product saves a couple of hours of nursing time, it translates to about $100. The pushback we get is that when we say we may free up 2 hours of nurse time, nobody gets fired. However, given the nursing shortage, 2 hours of not doing something monotonous improves quality. What is the best way to present this value?
Oh, that's another really good question.
They're really coming in.
Yeah, no, they really are, because there's, a lot of really interesting scenarios. What we've found over the years is that there are some facilities that just really respond to that kind of argument. Oh, we're reducing, 2 hours of nursing time. If we're doing that over, however many cases, looking at their case volume of, how many different patients of this type they have per week. And if it's 2 hours of nursing time per day for each of those patients, they start to sort of factor that in. If you talk to the facilities and kind of figure out where their shortfalls are and helping them to understand how that nursing time can be reallocated to some other part of the hospital where they really need more nursing time, that kind of an argument can really resonate. Some facilities just say, wow, you're saving nursing time, that's great. Others, you have to go into a more extensive conversation with them or help them understand how they could be reallocated. So again, I think a more detailed discussion about this offline would be great. Be very happy to talk with you further about that.
I have another question from Victoria, and that is, I imagine if I read on, I'll see this question again and again. What about companies with smaller budgets? How do we circumvent cost-prohibitive, larger studies to provide compelling economic studies and stories?
No, it's a great question, and it's something that I tried to address through the presentation. But this is a scenario we see every single day, and we tell everybody, start small. Let's brainstorm together and try and figure out what can we do with what you already have. You already have some data, you already have some information, whatever market you're going into, whatever indication, the current technology that you're trying to replace has literature. What can we find that's already out there that we can repackage and present to the facilities? Sometimes we do, and Julie, who's our director of reimbursement, who's on the line, can, testify to this. We develop what I call a what if argument. So if you have a case where it just flat out makes sense, common sense, that if we used your technology, we could reduce complication rates by some amount. And we'll, talk to the facilities about, okay, so what if our technology reduced your complication rate by 5%? What would that mean? Would that save you money? How much money? And we can develop a model that, shows if we reduce the complication rate by 5%, it would reduce your costs by this. And if it's believable, that they're like, well, yeah, we totally believe that it would reduce complications by, rate by 5%. Your clinical studies show it reduces it by 20%. So yeah, that makes sense. You can get a lot of mileage out of a what if kind of argument like that. We do it all the time. The other thing that we tell our smaller clients is, let's start small and see how far you get with it. So develop a what if kind of argument like that, take it out there, get some new clients. You're going to get pushback from some others. And then when you have a little more money, then we make it a little more rigorous. Now we try to get a little more data and we put it back out there. And so you just, do it in pieces, kind of phase it in. And we found, both those approaches to be really helpful.
Folks, it is the top of the hour. If you have to be somewhere else, we completely understand. We are going to probably continue, with Beth's permission, for another half hour. That's how many questions we have, Beth.
Okay, sure.
We are going to record the whole thing, and we will have the slides for you. I've already shared them, and we'll be sending out an email later today. Cassie asks a question, and I'm going to build on it a bit because I have this issue with my clients, and one that you know that I'm working with now, Beth. And that is, what is the best way to identify who is on the value analysis committee so that we can actually talk with them? Or is that not the way that it goes? Jessica adds onto that something of that nature as well. So that's another theme that I'm seeing here. How do you figure out who we're supposed to influence?
Yeah, and another great question. I mean, this is where, and we know that not all, companies are in the situation where you have this luxury just yet. This is where your sales force is so valuable. If you do have a sales force that's out there within these facilities, they'll know, they're talking to the physicians typically as their primary point of contact. They can get connected to who's on the value analysis committee. And understand who makes that up. Some hospitals actually, publish information about their value analysis committee and who makes up, that group. So just some intelligence, just on the ground intelligence is really the best way to figure out who's on the committee. If you're not able to get that information for whatever reason, I think we can make, pretty good suppositions about the kinds of people who are going to be on the committee. And, again, if you're working with, one key group within the hospital, if you're working with purchasing, there's going to be somebody from purchasing on that committee. And if you can arm them with the information, they will take it to the committee. You can't have the opportunity to present to the committee, as I said, during the presentation, but you can certainly, arm them with information and get information to them to consider.
Greg asks, how do you deal with products that are not under a GPO or an IDN contract?
So products that are not dealing with, not under a GPO or an IDN contract, and you're trying to infiltrate a hospital where those contracts are in place. I'm assuming
That's my understanding. Greg can type in a clarifier if he likes, but go ahead with that for now, please.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's the same kind of process that you need to go through. And, again, it's, you're just presenting your information, you're presenting your whole package of information to the value analysis committee or to your representative to the value analysis committee. And you're just laying it out there. The facility will say, the other technologies under the GPO, these are the, this is the pricing that we're getting. They're entering that side of the equation. You're presenting your side of the equation. If there's anything that you can do, to help them to make it work, then help them to make it work. But it's the same process. It's the same way of trying to, to just stack up your value, your costs, and your outcomes data side by side with what they're currently doing.
Thank you, and Greg confirmed that we got the question right. Jennifer asks, some clinical departments are only familiar with the gold standard of randomized control trials. When you run up against that, how do you build consensus that something alternative, like a case control study, is meaningful science?
Arm them with information. So there's a lot out in the literature right now about how very frequently in actual use, or what the buzzword these days is pragmatic or practical trials, randomized controlled trial is really not always the best design. So we can get in your hands, publications that speak to that say, for analyzing real life applications, this kind of trial design is absolutely acceptable. In some cases, it's preferable over RCTs. So it's really a re-education process, because you do hear that, everybody in their kind of early clinical training, and many others in their early healthcare management training will have heard, RCT, it's always the way to go, and it's just not true anymore. That that's always the standard. So there's a lot of information that we could help you to put in their hands to help re-educate them. It's really a re-education process.
Lee asks that his key contact representing him to the VAC is a doctor, but in this case, the doctor is reluctant to champion the battle. Is there anything that he can do about that? I mean, how to approach that when your way in is a clinical argument and you need the doctor, but they're just not as enthusiastic, I guess, as you are. And is there another workaround? What do you do in those cases?
Well, given that you can't bump that doctor off and replace him or her with another
You
doctor.
didn't mean kill them, did you?
No, I did not. Absolutely not.
It was more like a bumper car kind of analogy.
That's exactly. You understand.
Yes.
You know, it's, again, that's sort of a funny question to me, because again, I hear that all the time, and it's interesting because, you know, physicians can be our best champions, and they can also just be, you know, our nemesis, you know, when they're in a situation like that. Sometimes you have physicians who just don't want to talk about anything else, and it's not that they don't like your technology, it's just that they're not going to get enthusiastic about anything. And other times it's that, you know, you haven't given them the right information to get them excited about it. But if you've got a physician that, you know, just will not be your champion for whatever reason, and we could talk more offline about what those reasons might be, try to find another champion who will. You know, if this physician is just not going to go in super gung-ho about either the clinical evidence, or certainly not going to go in and help present your economic information, try and get that physician to network you with someone else, and try to work another angle and get into the VAC in that way.
Jessica and Mary both ask this question. Basically, will hospitals ever give you their own data for you to work with to show your case? Is that possible? Does that ever happen?
Yes, it does. It does. You know, surprisingly, it does. Yes. So, you know, one of the things that VACs do is, you know, as I said, you know, they're trying to evaluate and trial technologies. And a lot of times they'll let you help them trial the technology. They'll let you help them design, you know, the appropriate data capture. And they'll give you the information to kind of feed into that. You know, with these budgetary impact models that I talked about a lot, we always design them to run even if the facility doesn't enter any of their own data, but we always give them an opportunity to enter their own data where they will. You know, they don't often just say, here's all of our data, have at it, but they'll go back and do their homework. You know, you can say what we need are, you know, we need these 5 data elements. Can you go back and, you know, mine this from your facility and come back to us with that information, and we'll put it into the model. And sometimes they'll be even more open than that. So yeah, they will, because it'll benefit them if they share with you and they can see, you know, what the implications might be, even if it's, you know, in an early discussion and it's a little bit speculative, or they're actually, you know, taking you through a trial process.
When she asks, in a fee-for-service environment, a technology that improves long-term performance and reduces total cost of care per patient actually reduces the total number of procedures for the hospital. Are you with me still?
Yep.
Okay. The question is, would patient outcome improvement plus cost of care reduction arguments be strong enough? How do you recommend we address that challenge?
Well, there are very few facilities right now that operate purely under a fee-for-service environment. You know, hospitals have contracts with so many different payers, and there's so many different types of contracts. Most hospitals now have, you know, a number of different contracts that are already, you know, some form of value-based reimbursement. Maybe they're a part of an accountable care organization where things are bundled. They're looking at it. They're being forced to look at things long-term. It might not be all elements of the hospital, all procedures, all contracts, but some of it is. And they're moving more and more in that direction. And I would say, regardless of what happens with the current administration and what happens to the Affordable Care Act, it's going to keep moving in that direction, moving away from fee-for-service, more towards value-based reimbursement. So we always tell our clients, prepare both arguments, be prepared to talk about both things, be prepared to say, yep, you're right, purely fee-for-service, this is how you're going to stack up, but lay out the value-based reimbursement at the same time and help them to understand, that it's already impacting them and then it's going to impact them more and more. And then, again, given the particulars of the situation, there's probably other nuanced things that we could do as well to kind of help build that story.
Sujatha asks, how often are technologies evaluated by the VAC? Is it only when they make a new entry, on an annual schedule, or something else?
It really depends on the facility. Some of them do it on, a schedule. It's never just on an annual basis. I don't think. They typically have, monthly meetings set up where they're taking action on a number of different technologies, and you get on the docket to be considered in those meetings. Some of them do it on a quarterly basis. Some of them, it's a little bit more ad hoc, but it really just depends.
Thank you. We have time to go back to some of Carlo's other questions. What is the role of nursing in the VAC? Who is typically the leader for the VAC? Doc, nurse, quality officer, who?
Again, that varies, and in some hospitals, the leadership kind of rotates, amongst the different members. There's always a nurse representative on the VAC, and they all have a vote. Again, I can't speak to every single VAC at every single hospital in the country, but there's always, a representative, so that we're seeing, exactly what. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for just a second, but there are representatives from the nursing side, from the clinical side, from quality improvement, from the supply side, and they're able to have a vote and have a discussion point. So it's really not as important who the leader is, but it's the way that whole committee comes together to evaluate.
Craig asks, what comes first, influencing the payer or influencing the VAC?
That's another good question. So, some of the cases that we talked about, there really is no payer play to make at all. It's really something that doesn't concern the payer in any way. But there were some cases, and at least one of the examples that I talked through, where there was a payer play and a VAC play. In my experience, it's typically you can convince the value analysis committees more quickly than you can convince payers. And so you're playing them at the same time, but you're probably getting success with some value analysis committees more quickly than you're getting with the payers. So for example, very often we're going into the value analysis committee and saying, okay, we don't have widespread coverage yet. So let's suppose you use our technology, but you're not getting reimbursed, in the way that we would ultimately like to be reimbursed, because the payer coverage is slower to develop. Let's take that as a given, and let's show you how that still impacts your scenario. So the example that I talked through of the diagnostic that was taking away from the diagnostic revenue and was, increasing the treatment cycle revenue, we were able to show them and incorporated this in the model. Okay, let's suppose that in only, some small percentage of cases are you actually getting reimbursed by the payers. What does that still look like for you? And kind of incorporating it in that way. And then as you build payer coverage, which you'll be working that angle at the same time, then, that can be a modifiable variable in your analysis, so that, okay, well, now maybe 50% of your claims will be paid, versus the 10%, that we worked in initially.
I enjoy Carlo's next question. It's kind of a math problem. It's the transitive property of outcomes. Basically, a new technology almost never has data about improved outcomes when it launches. Can that company say, well, product A improves measurement B, and we're kind of like product A, so we should be able to too. Does that work?
It can work for a while. Yeah, that kind of features into the what if argument. Do you believe this? Do you believe that, since this technology improves in this way, and given ours that looks very much like it and maybe is a little bit better in these believable ways, would you buy into that and kind of use that initially? Ultimately you will need your own data, but you can get some mileage with that early on.
Okay. Clay and Peter asked questions that I don't completely understand, so if either of them want to type in a clarification, I may be able to ask it on air. And I have a question for Carlo. Where do you work and what do you do? I'm intrigued. My last Carlo question for now, and I'm sure you'll be talking to him afterward, is about customizing VAC presentations. He says that a client has used information from ahd.com that outlines economic details for a specific hospital so that someone could define the value of a day in a hospital. Assuming that the new product shortens length of stay, a calculation can be done that shows that's worth this much to the hospital. Is that approach still working?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, quite often we'll, build things just based on national averages and let the hospital put their own data in there in terms of, a cost per hospital day. But we've also built tools that, are interactive and let you, kind of select the hospital name in Excel. And the moment you select the hospital name, there's a back-end database and it pulls that hospital's information from the American Hospital Directory, loads that cost per hospital day into the tool, and then proceeds like that. So you're automating it more to make it easier on the facility. So yeah, absolutely, that's even better than going in with a national average and then letting them adjust it themselves when you can do that.
Thank you. Peter came back with a clarification saying that he has a question specific to surgical ICUs. He asks, should the VAC presentation be specific to the nursing directors of the SICU and the physician and someone in purchasing? Basically, if I understand you, Peter, to whom should we tailor the presentation?
Again, it kind of depends. I'd want to know a little bit more about the technology and what it's doing, but I would tailor it to tell the clinical story from the SICU perspective, from the nursing staff or the physician perspective, whatever was appropriate. Tell the clinical story from that perspective, and then tell the economic story from a larger perspective. It's not just whatever the economic implications are, they may be felt within the SICU, but they're also, that's a part of the larger organization. So that's a larger story that you can tell. But the clinical story might only truly be understood by, the clinical staff in that particular setting.
Clay, I have your question, but I'm going to jump ahead to Mindy's question because it amuses me personally. So sorry about that. Mindy asks, how do you promote a low-cost product that is clearly a common sense practice in an environment where common sense is not common?
Well, that is a good question, and that amuses me. It amuses me too. So this would be a low-cost item that I assume, though, is an additional cost. It's not replacing a higher cost item. Is that right,
Mindy? Yes, it is an additional cost, she says.
Okay, but if it's an additional cost that is a common sense thing that's smart to do, then what makes it a smart thing to do from a common sense perspective? It must improve outcomes. It must reduce other costs of care, paint that picture in a way that you're not relying on common sense. So you're going to assume they don't have the common sense to see that and to see it as a no-brainer. And so you put it down and quantify it in a way that, anybody could see it, even if they don't have a lick of sense.
Fair enough. Clay asks, a good one. He offers a no-charge product evaluation. Sounds like a reasonable way in. He says sometimes he requires VAC approval to do even that. And oftentimes he's asked for a price prior to the VAC submission or gaining even the privilege of doing a no-charge product evaluation. Is there any way for him to get around this?
Probably not. No. And again, that sort of, feeds directly from the previous question about common sense. Yes, even if it's a no charge for them, they're going to want to know what they're potentially signing up for in the future if they go through that, because it's not going to be no charge to them in the long term. They want to see what that could potentially look like up front. And so, one way that you could potentially address it is to say, kind of develop a value-based pricing, yourself. And I know that there are some companies, some of the larger medical device companies are doing this too, that it's this price if you're able to achieve these outcomes. And so, tie it to outcomes. And you can do something like that up front. So it, again, is showing them that there's a lower risk, but they are going to ask. And unfortunately, there's no real way around that.
Beth, I pretty much got to every question. There's one or two, some people have left. But this was super fun. I mean, I really genuinely enjoyed this and learned a thing or two.
Well, thank you. It was great for me. And thanks for all the great questions and for hanging around this long. I can see there's still 67 people who have hung around for an hour and
Yes,
22 minutes. So that was
that's right.
great.
Yeah, that's the mark of a solid presentation. What would you say in an elevator, one sentence thing, to summarize what we need to know about how to get past the value analysis committee?
I would say remember that they're your customers and be creative when it comes to presenting information to them, understanding that they're trying to assess combined clinical and economic value.
Makes sense to me as a marketer and a storyteller. It really comes down to stories, even if it's complicated stuff.
Yep, it absolutely does. And that's the language that I always use too, is you need to tell your story in a way that's compelling.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Beth a warm medical device group applause of thank you. People are cheering from
Thanks
their
very
desks.
much.
Some of them are in cubicles. They can't make a lot of noise. Jessica writes, yay, yay. Jennifer writes, thank you. Victoria says, you're right. She is an excellent presenter. So there you
Well,
go.
thank you. Bless
Positive
you. I
affirmation.
appreciate that.
Mindy says, thank you. Jessica says, awesome. Wonderful presentation, says Sherry. Thank you. I will recommend you, says Jessica. We really enjoyed that, says Wenshi. They can't help themselves. They're falling over themselves. I have worked with Beth, and all of your praise is rightly deserved. I will conclude with that. And in the meanwhile, I'll see you online. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Bye.